In our series, we explore what might have been history's greatest mistakes, the moments where things took a turn for the worse. In this episode, we look at a power plant in northern Ukraine and the fateful decision that poisoned a generation. On April 26, 1986, a nuclear reactor at the Chernobyl power plant near the city of Pripyat began to destabilize. Technicians struggled to control the situation as the reactor's power output fluctuated wildly. At 1:23 a.m., an uncontrolled power surge melted through the reactor's fuel rods and blew the top off the reactor. The Chernobyl disaster had begun. In the first few days after the explosion, 31 people died from acute radiation sickness. The nearby city of Pripyat was evacuated and contaminated areas were quarantined. For decades, the Soviet Union kept secret the full extent of the disaster. But today, we know that the Chernobyl disaster claimed somewhere between 4,000 and 9,000 lives. And tragically, thousands more remain at risk. The effects of the disaster are still being studied. But what caused the Chernobyl nuclear disaster? If we go back to 1974, we can identify the moment when things started to go wrong. In 1974, a new safety test was being developed for nuclear reactors. This test would push the reactor to its limits to ensure it would not destabilize under extreme circumstances. But the engineers who designed the test made one critical mistake. They didn't factor in certain material properties. During the test, these factors would cause the reactor to become unstable, which would eventually lead to overheating. And that's how we got here, right? Wrong. There's another story to this. Let's go back to 1974. Once again, the year is 1974. Engineers Viktor Stepuk and Nikolai Fomin have designed a new safety test for nuclear reactors. But unlike the test we just saw, this one will be conducted by human operators. The plan is simple. Reduce the reactor's power output and remove the control rods. This will destabilize the reactor and allow the operators to practice emergency procedures. Again, the idea is to push the reactor to its limits and see if it can withstand the stress. But once again, there is a problem. In this scenario, the reactor is destabilized, but not pushed all the way to the edge. To do that, the operators would need to reduce the power output even further, below the minimum amount of energy required to sustain the reaction. When this happens, the reactor's automated systems kick in and begin to shut down the reactor. But before the shutdown is complete, the operators must restart the pumps. This will allow the reactor to cool down and prevent an emergency shutdown. But if the pumps fail to start, the cooling water could boil and the fuel rods could overheat, leading to a meltdown. This is where the mistake was made. While designing the test, Stepuk and Fomin did not realize the following. If they removed the control rods and reduced the reactor's power below a certain level, the pumps might fail to restart. On the night of the test, the operators followed the test procedure precisely. They reduced the power output and removed the control rods. But after a few minutes, the pumps failed to restart. As the reactor began to overheat, alarms blared. The operators knew something was wrong, but they weren't sure what. They tried everything they could think of to restart the pumps, but nothing worked. When the shift supervisor was informed of the situation, he ordered the operators to bring the reactor back online. But it was too late. The damage was done. The cooling water boiled and the fuel rods overheated, causing the core to melt and explode. The force of the blast was equivalent to 500 tons of TNT. It blew the roof off the reactor building and sent a plume of radioactive debris into the atmosphere. What makes the story so sad is that this disaster could have been prevented. All it would have taken was for Stepuk and Fomin to realize the limitations of their design. But they didn't, and when the dust settled, they would pay the price. Both men were charged with criminal negligence. Fomin was sentenced to 10 years in prison, but his sentence was later reduced to 5 years. Stepuk received a suspended sentence. So why did they make the mistake? We don't know. Perhaps they were overworked, or maybe they were under pressure to make the test as realistic as possible. Whatever the reason, their mistake would change the world forever. The Chernobyl disaster is considered the worst nuclear accident in history. It covers an area of 100,000 square kilometers, and while most of the radiation has dissipated, some areas remain too dangerous to live in. Over the years, many efforts have been made to clean up the mess, but it's a slow process. It will take decades to fully decontaminate the area. The disaster also had a major impact on the environment. Large numbers of animals and plants were killed by the radiation. The remaining wildlife is at risk of extinction. The disaster also had a major impact on the economy. Thousands of people had to be evacuated from their homes. Many of them lost their jobs. The cleanup effort has cost billions of dollars. And then there's the health effects. We already know that the disaster killed at least 4,000 people. But it's hard to say exactly how many more will die from cancer and other radiation-related illnesses. Some estimates put the number in the tens of thousands. Others say it could be as high as 90,000. There's no doubt that the Chernobyl disaster was a tragedy. But there's also something else about it that makes it unique. It's the only disaster of its kind that could have been so easily prevented. If Stepuk and Fomin had simply done their job correctly, none of this would have ever happened. It's hard to say what would have happened if the test had been successful. Maybe nothing would have come of it. Maybe it would have become a footnote in history. But it's safe to say it wouldn't have caused anywhere near the devastation that it did. It's easy to look back now and point fingers, but it's important to remember that Stepuk and Fomin were just doing their jobs. They were trying to make a reactor safer. They never meant to harm anyone. But sometimes even well-meaning actions can have terrible consequences. After the disaster, the Soviet Union was eager to learn from its mistakes. A number of changes were made to improve safety at nuclear power plants. These changes were not only adopted in the Soviet Union but around the world. Today, nuclear power is one of the safest forms of energy production. The chances of a meltdown are extremely low. If you think about it, we're all just trying to make the world a better place. Sometimes we make mistakes, but it's important to learn from them. Otherwise, we'll just keep repeating them. I'm sure by now you've seen a lot of videos about the Chernobyl disaster. They're all great, but this one is my favorite. It does a great job of explaining the technical aspects of the disaster without getting bogged down in the politics. What do you think? What would you do differently if you were in charge? Let me know in the comments. If you liked this video, please subscribe. It really helps me out. Thanks for watching. See you next time.